Best Disney figure? Oh, okay. Best Disney figure. I'm kind of a Goofy fan, honestly.
Yeah,
Like I remember some of the older animations he was in where it was like, oh, do Goofy's gonna go in and do this thing and we're gonna watch him do it. Um, like for some reason I just found those to be the most hilarious things ever. I don't know why.
I think that's a very good choice. If anybody have a different opinion on the best Disney figure ever, please do share in the chat while we're at sharing goofy, funny, nerdy things. Then we have gotten started. We've put on the recording. I'm going to share my screen, just give you an intro, and then I am excited to see your session, Jared. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to help.
So, as I just mentioned, and please let me know if you can all see my screen well, then today we're having intro to Parks PySpark in Microsoft Fabric. Very relevant, very good for all of us to learn more about. I also want to let you know this session will be recorded. I've just put on the recording. We will also make it available on LinkedIn. We'll make it available on YouTube. We'll make posts about that. We will start sending out feedback mail soon. We always want to learn, we want to get better. So please do answer them. And then, of course, we want to let you all know that, everybody is here to have a good time to learn. So please be respectful and friendly towards everybody and engage with questions in the chat, and we'll take it up as we can. What do you prefer, Jared? Do we take it as we go along, or do we take it at the end?
Um, I'm fine with questions as we go. I'll try to do my best here and there to pause here and there and make sure that we're checking questions, but especially, I want to make sure that at least those questions get answered when it's relevant. I think that at least shows up a little bit better in the recording.
Perfect. So we'll get started. I think I'm just gonna stop sharing and mute somebody. And then over to you, Jared, and thank you so much for being here with us. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure thing. So I will go ahead and share screen here and make sure I bring that up there because I like to see. Okay, good. I like to at least be able to see the other faces of people who are here for those who have their camera. Oh,
I think you got muted, Jared. Can I ask you to unmute yourself?
yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
there we go. All right, not sure what happened there, but sorry about that. And I will share screen here. All right, can everybody see my slide deck?
I'm good.
Awesome. All right, well then we'll go ahead and kick in. So we're talking about PySpark today. We're talking about it specifically within the context of Fabric. Again, thanks to the group for inviting me, and happy to share some info with you today. So a little bit about me. My name is Jared Keene. I'm a senior data engineer for a company called Heartland Business Systems. We're a consulting firm based out of the Midwestern US, so kind of central US. Pretty much doing anything under the sun with Microsoft products, especially. Me personally, I've been working in the data industry for about 10 years. That's about all the technical stuff you need to know about me, other than the fact that I do have both of the active Fabric certifications as this moment. So that's a lot of what is spurring the information that I'm sharing today. The other important thing you need to know about me is that I'm not just a technical guy. My goal here is I'm part data guy, part storyteller. And that's because I feel if you go back to the start of time, we learned to share information through stories first. We didn't learn to do it through reports and all these other things. And so I'm really trying to take a look at things from that angle because I think that's the way we best learn things is through storytelling. And I just realized that is not an image of me. Clearly, that's AI generated. Let me see. Nope, that one's not any better. Okay, yeah. That's what I actually look like when I'm trying to be a normal person. But if it's not clear from this and from you can't really see it right now, but I have a Weird Al book behind me. Weird Al is my favorite guy in the world. I'm kind of a weirdie. So expect a lot of weird things to happen from here on out, but hopefully educational. Now, as far as today goes, we're going to talk about PySpark. So first of all, at least we're going to make sure everybody understands what exactly is Python, what is Spark, how do the two work together, and more importantly, why. From there, we're going to quickly shift into some things specific with PySpark. I'm going to try and spend a lot of time in demonstration today because I think showcasing the environment, it's a lot easier to show not just what Spark can do, but what's the benefit of using it within Fabric. And then finally, this is intended as an introduction. So I'll try and do my best to answer any specific questions that you have, but I'm not going to be able to prepare you to be a master of everything within PySpark, within Fabric, within an hour period. So, what are those next steps that you need to take to really brush up on the skill sets you need to be successful in this environment? I'll give you a couple of encouragements and a couple of people I would recommend following to get those next steps in. With that, we'll jump in to today's topic. So first of all, PySpark. All right, we've heard about Python for a very long period of time, and then suddenly this PySpark thing showed up, and everybody's like, what is this? Why are we bothering? Well, let's just quickly go over what is Python, what is Spark. So first of all, when we're talking about Python, if you've been working in the data industry for a while, and especially in recent years, Python is probably something you've heard of quite a bit. It's becoming very popular for people who are wanting to work with data. Not exactly where it started, though. It was originally just a third generation programming language, and it's grown into something that's heavily used for data. And Python is great for a lot of things, but there's one glaring limitation that Python on its own has is that Python was really designed that when it was going to work with data sets, it works with smaller sets, things that can easily fit into memory. It's because a lot of the engines use a single node for computing, using something called the global interpreter lock. If you want to take a look at that, make sure you do some research on that. Search for that specific keyword. You'll get some additional information on that. But everybody still likes the libraries that Python has and using it for data. So what do we do for large amounts of data? Well, that is where PySpark comes into it. You can really think of PySpark as a Python API for Apache Spark. So you may be writing Python or you might be writing Python with a little bit of Spark in there. But the big thing here is that you're using it within the context of a specific environment, Apache Spark. This helps us solve the data problem by allowing us to work with big data. So now we're working with distributed computing. So rather than a singular node, you're going to be taking a data set saying, go and perform this action. That gets distributed across nodes and across executors, performs those functions, and with Spark's capabilities of using resilient distributed data sets, again, that's another keyword to do some research on if you want to know the ins and outs of the Spark environment. That is what now enables us to work with larger data sets. And library-wise, still has a lot of libraries that supports working with data and supports working with big data. So then let's at least make sure everybody understands the Python language. I don't remember if Zoom has this, but for those who are on, if anybody could at least share reactions or any concerns, is anybody new to Python? Haven't spent any time writing Python yet? Because if so, we'll gloss through this fairly quickly. Okay, at least Emily has not. All right, so far at least I'm getting nothing but nopes, so this is good. So let's at least make sure. Um, all right. All right, so let's at least assume that everybody's a little bit new to Python. Again, I'm not going to be able to get you to be a master of Python, but I'm at least going to give you enough to understand today's session. I'll have some more resources on this session. So important things to note, I've got an example script here written in Python. And here's a couple things to help you at least learn how to read Python. First of all, use that hashtag to comment, not just for Twitter and other social media areas. That hashtag is how we get our green text, which as we know from most IDEs we work with in code, green text equals comment, not something that's actually executed. And technically, it'll be for single comments, The Python language, I'll say, technically has multi-line comments in the use of quotes. I'll say I don't see that a whole lot often. I'd say for most people, they don't like it because instead of turning your text green, it turns your text red, which makes it look like text strings, but it's not exactly the same thing. So most times, if you're looking to comment, make sure you use that hashtag. Import, keyword that means you're importing libraries. This is again where if you want to make best use of the Python language, before you get too heavy into writing your code, look for the libraries that have been made by the community that are going to support your specific function. Speaking of functions, DEF is our next keyword, means we're creating a function. Third generation programming language means we like creating functions. We might create classes depending on how sophisticated we want to get with it. DEF, greet name. Here's a basic example of a function definition, and this is all that it's doing. Print being it's printing to console. One important thing to note that comes in with functions and comes in a number of cases. Indents in the Python language are necessary. So if you like having everything as just a single, like nothing is indented, sorry, Python at least won't work for you, or at least in that case, you won't be able to do function definitions, which require indents. Case statements or other conditional statements require that. Loops, try statements, all of those things, you define at least where your function call starts. Everything that is included in the function definition, it identifies that by the following lines that are indented from that definition. Praise be the data frame. So if you've heard things about Python and you've heard about people working with data, you've probably heard about the data frame. If you haven't looked at that yet, get familiar with it. Not necessarily that you have to work with data in data frames, but it is a very common situation. And again, thinking about those libraries, there are many libraries out there that support effectively working with data defined in a data frame. So as long as you're making use of that, you're going to have a good time. Data frames are pretty great for that reason. Pandas is at least one of the most common libraries used for data frames. And here's at least an example definition there. Variables can be pretty much anything. The definitions of variables, you can see an example I have here of message equals hello world. Defining the variable itself is pretty much you just give it a name and that's it. If you work with PowerShell, this should be very common, or this should sound very familiar because PowerShell works in similar ways. So everything you need to know about variables is just give it a name, equal sign, and then whatever you pass into it, be it text, be it an integer, be it an object, it will adopt whatever the data type is that you pass into it. And then at least I'll call out formatting strings is a common example and one of the nice things of dealing with data in Fabric. Sometimes you're dealing with situations where either for printing to your logs or for other things you might want to insert a value into text. Python makes it very easy to do by putting a just F in front of your text, putting out your text in something like double quotes, and then these curly brackets. This is where I can identify something outside of the text. So in this case, I'm referencing a variable named Alice. So this will say hello Alice when it prints to console down there. Final thing, again, Python is a language that is heavily supported by the community. So, as you're getting into the language, some of the things I would strongly recommend, start thinking about those guidelines of how should you format your Python code so that it can be easily distributed to many people. In those types of situations, I would strongly encourage the PEP 8 guidelines are pretty simple and straightforward to follow. Those are the ones that I typically follow. And I would encourage you to at least follow that guide or something else to make sure that your code is easily understood. That'll be especially important in an environment like Fabric where it's very easy to share code. All right, so that's the Python side. Now let's start talking about the environment side of it, Apache Spark, which starts getting us in the direction of PySpark. Up here, I have a graphic of the workspace settings which is typically in most situations where you're going to be configuring your Spark settings. There are a couple of tenant settings that you can set at the Fabric tenant level that will be used as either limiting factors or otherwise overriding what is done at the workspace level. But most of the configurations you'll do in the Spark area will happen on the screen that you have here. In case you're new to Spark, again, the goal here is that we're going to be setting up an environment to set up a set of nodes and executors on that nodes or on those nodes to perform our functions. We want to do distributed computing. What comes with that is more often than not, Apache Spark is not something that is just up and running 24/7, although you can technically do that if you want. I'm not 100% sure if you can do that within Fabric though. So typically when you're working with Fabric, you should expect I'm going to start up resources, I'm going to perform my functions, and when that's done, I'm going to get rid of those compute resources. So that's at least where we need to talk more specifically about configuration because our configuration determines what gets spun up and then what gets deallocated when our processing has completed. So important things to note, and I'll at least gloss over this a little bit to say that any of these things, talk about it with your Fabric administrator. They're ultimately the ones who should best help you with anything in this area. But here are some things I think you should know getting started in this environment. Again, to lead to some conversations you should have with your Fabric admin. First thing, you may talk to your admin and you might hear them talk about Spark pools. Spark pools means the hardware. So the graphic here is showing a starter pool configuration. This is talking about when we start up your compute, what are the resources that you have available? What's important to know about your pools is that you need to correspond your capacity to then what you can configure in terms of nodes, because the capacity, the F2, F4, F8, all the way up to F2048, that capacity that is provisioned to your workspace, that impacts the number of cores you have available to use within Apache Spark, within Fabric. The basic rules around this is that um, the number of your capacity. So F2, for example, means you have two capacity units or two CUs. For each capacity unit, you get two Spark vCores at your disposal. So F2 SKU means at base you have four Spark vCores at your disposal to then provision within your pools. On top of that, Fabric allows the ability to burst resources. They want to give you additional resources that you need to use then to get your solutions done as fast as possible. So when you're thinking about provisioning these nodes, you can actually define things to burst your resources up to 3 times whatever that number is that I just gave. So we take 4 and we multiply it by 3 and we actually get 20, which is an exception in which is actually an exception for an F2 SKU. F2 actually gives you a time 5, but as you can see from this graphic here, most other SKUs is just bursting up to times 3. So this number here is essentially the max number of vCores that you would have available to configure within it. Then finally, you have to translate that into node size, which depending on the SKU you're using, can be anywhere from small, I believe is the smallest SKU that you, or the smallest node that you can create. But if you're working with really large SKUs like F64s and above, you can get anywhere from, I believe, XX large is the maximum node size that you can create. That node then determines how many vCores you have. So take an example of our F2 SKU. You can set up you can set up 5 small nodes that hits your max limit of 20 here. Medium for an F2, you can do 2 because 2 medium nodes would give you 16. A third node would put you to 24, which goes over your limit. Or you can do a singular large, which gives you 16. and again, the corresponding memory for that. So, how exactly should you configure this for your workspace? That's at least where you should have the conversation with your Fabric admin, who should be monitoring your processes when they run and should be able to tell you this is how we should configure things. So, work with them on that. Other things you should talk about with your Fabric admin is your environment definition. So, where Spark Tools is talking about the hardware, environments is talking about the configurations. So, that's where we're talking about specific runtimes, which Fabric will give you. Right now, there's technically three runtimes. One is about to get deprecated. Um, so you can pick your runtimes. Also, if you need specific libraries or resources available, maybe you've written some Python classes that you want to use throughout your notebooks again and again and again. In those situations, you'd want to talk to your Fabric admin about building an environment that will have all of that stuff readily available for you when you start working in your Apache Spark environment. And then finally, one thing to clarify in terms of uh, working with environments is the question of high concurrency. This has come up a couple of times. High concurrency, if you've looked it up on Fabric, is saying that you can run multiple notebooks or multiple Apache solutions at the same time. Know that this is for a single user. So if you're wanting to use high concurrency and you want multiple users to use that same high concurrency environment, they would have to share credentials in order to do so. So high concurrency is really great for the single developer who might be writing 3 or 4 notebooks interactively at the same time. Then a high concurrency session works for you. But beyond that, high concurrency kind of hits that limitation of a single user. If at any point you get to a point and you hit this message down here about too many requests for capacity, that's where presumably somewhere in this configuration that we're talking about here, you've hit a limit of these maximum cores, presumably by sessions or by the number of nodes that are provisioned right now, and ultimately your vCores. So if you ever hit this message when you are running something in a notebook, talk to your Fabric admin again. They're the ones who can tell you what exactly is going on. Final thing that at least we need to know then, so that gives us Python information. That helps us understand what Fabric Spark looks like. Now let's talk notebooks. All right, so notebooks is going to be your best way to work with PySpark in Fabric. You can technically create Apache Spark jobs, but those are typically expected as more of a you define it and it's used for automation. It's not really used for an interactive experience. Notebooks were initially designed for that interactive experience for a couple of reasons. First of all, at least to be clear, we're talking about Jupyter notebooks. So when I'm speaking about notebooks, if you work with Jupyter notebooks before in other environments, it's the same experience just within Fabric. What the notebooks gives you is it gives you cell-driven development. I have a basic example here on the screen of something. We'll be looking at this within demo in more detail. But the benefit of working with a notebook is I can break up my code cell by cell versus having to break it out into separate files. Well, what benefit does this give me? This gets into the interactive nature of working with notebooks in Fabric. If I have 4 cells of code and the first 2 cells are fairly stable, I don't need to make a whole lot of changes to them. I can go ahead and start up a session and run those 2 lines of code or those 2 cells of code, and the end results of those 2 cells of code will sit there in memory. Then, if I'm constantly working on making adjustments to my third cell, but for me to run it, it requires information from the first 2 cells. Because I've run those first 2 cells, I don't need to run them again. I can just focus on running my third cell on its own, and maybe if like each of my cells only takes like 5 seconds, maybe it's not a big deal. But suppose cells 1 and 2 take 15 to 20 minutes to run. I want to be able to run those cells once and then just work on my third cell interactively, keeping that information stable. Cell-driven development enables you to do that. Beyond that, the cells separating your code means you can create specific cells for Markdown, which gets into documentation. If you've worked with Markdown before, Markdown is more of like an HTML approach to writing things within a notebook, and that means you can actually create formatted documentation that lives within your notebook. If this is a notebook that you might be sharing across multiple developers, this is a great way to make sure that your documentation lives with your code, and hopefully in doing so means your code is never misinterpreted. Finally, in terms of data sources, this is looking at it from the lens of the UI, which I'll show you in just a moment. And most times when you're working with data sources, you're going to be working with lakehouses or warehouses. Now, I say or in that you can write your solutions and you can write your notebooks to work with both at the same time. What the UI is going to encourage is that it's going to encourage that you either work with lakehouses or warehouses. So that's at least, again, what the UI will encourage, not necessarily that you can't. And that's especially where we talk about other resources such as things like event houses. Not necessarily that you can't use notebooks to work with them, but in cases like that, the UI is not going to give you a whole lot of help for working with those. So when you're thinking about utilizing notebooks, think about what data store you're going to work with. That will impact how you set up your notebooks. All right. And with that, that at least starts getting us into demos. So let's see. All right, about half an hour in. Let's talk about well, actually, let's stop for questions. Anybody have any questions so far? I'm not seeing anything in chat. Anybody have anything else they want to say verbally?
I'm not
Okay.
seeing any questions so far, but please do let me know in the chat if there is any questions.
Okay. All right. Well, then while people might be thinking about questions, I'm going to go and shift over to my demo environment.
It's just been crystal clear like this picture.
Aw. Yeah, that's a nice picture. I don't even know where that is. It's just some generic Windows environment. All right. So let's get into demos. So right here, I've got my demo notebook up that we'll be looking at for today. So this is obviously something that I pre-scripted. How did I get there? Well, in any sort of workspace that is Fabric enabled, I can go in, I can go up to new item. All I have to do is search for notebook, and you'll see that this notebook will show up at least currently 4 times in the UI. There's no difference between them. They are the exactly same notebook and the same capabilities. So once you get to this point, just pick one. Why then have it in there multiple times? I guess for people who don't like filtering and like scrolling. So, and then at least there it shows up as a line item anywhere like any other items do within Fabric. Now, before we talk too deeply about code, again, the goal here is where I want to make sure you understand the environment you're going to be working in and how to best make use of it so that then once you learn how to use Python in more detail, you can then take that next step. So let's go over some important things about the UI. And I'm going to follow my notes here in my Markdown cell. So I talked about Markdown just a little bit ago. This is the potential of what you can build when you use a Markdown cell. And what I mean by that is you can see when I hover over here a couple spots, you'll see plus code plus Markdown. This up here is Markdown. This down here is a code cell. So anything up here, even if I write in code, it's not going to execute, but a code section will. All right, now let's see. Within my Markdown notes, let's see. Attaching lake houses and warehouses to the notebook. All right. So what I'm talking about there is we start on the left pane here in the Explorer section. You've worked with SSMS, you probably work with most IDEs. They have this left section over here that gives you useful information. In a Fabric environment, this is where it's giving you information about lake houses and warehouses that are connected to your notebook. Resources would be more along the lines of those environments that I talked about. Environments means you can also have specific resources as part of your environment. In this case, I have a lake house and a warehouse defined. I did that by going into this section here, so I'll show it for a lake house, hit the plus sign, and that's where I can add a lake house, either a brand new one that I'm going to create a lake house item, or an existing one, either with schema or without schema. I hit the add button here. This shows me which ones I have available. I can check this, hit connect, and that's how I get this to show up here. The additional important thing to note here is if you go down this route, notice here this pin here. This indicates that what I've just done is I've created a connection from this notebook to this lake house, and it's going to define it as a default lake house. Now, what does that mean? Default lakehouse means the notebook's metadata. So the notebook itself is ultimately a very large JSON structure that includes your code and the structure of your notebook. Part of that includes identifying what lakehouses and warehouses are connected in to your notebook. This is an important thing to note because if you work in multi-environments, dev, test, production, the metadata is in the notebook. And right now, if you're using things like the deployment pipelines let you reassign the default. It does not let you reassign other lake houses. So if you're connected to 3 or 4 lake houses in here, the deployment pipeline will let you reset the default lake house. It will not let you reset the others. So if you work multi-environment, again, talk with your Fabric admin about the fact of you having no lake houses connected to your notebooks, because you'll need to come up with a game plan of how you are going to move your notebooks appropriately, but not having to the lake houses in a previous state. The other thing you'll note here is right now I'm working in a PySpark environment. So I can say that because right now I've set my default language up here to PySpark. And these are the options that you have available. That ultimately determines what I get to work with via the UI in terms of Lakehouse Warehouse. Pretty much anything that's in the Spark area, Lakehouses are going to be easily supported. Warehouses are not going to be supported as far as some of the UI features. Python will actually support both. T-SQL will support the warehouses, but not the lakehouses, at least not without using the SQL Analytics endpoint of the lake house. But if you use that, then you're working with your lake house in more of a read-only capacity. We're going to be focusing on things within PySpark today. So we're going to focus on lake houses, but I at least want to call that out so that it clears up any confusion here within the UI. Let's see. I'll also say, as long as I'm talking about this here, this checkmark indicates the default language. So suppose I go in here and I add in a new code cell here, that's what determines what ends up here in the bottom right. That indicates the language for this cell. Not that I can't necessarily change that. I can certainly go in and change it to a different language, but now that language is exclusive to this cell. And if I generate another cell, it's still going to be PySpark. All right. So that's at least a lot about the lake house. And why am I taking all this time to talk about the UI here? Well, let me at least show the demo that everybody is, I feel like, legally obligated to do anytime you're doing a notebook demo within a Fabric environment. By getting this connected in here, I can take something like dim customer, drag and drop it over here, and it gives me a quick select top 1,000 of my data set. So I don't have to bother with figuring out where exactly it is in my ABFS storage, which is the background of all of this. I don't have to find out all of that information. I can just drag and drop, and that immediately gets me into my data. And the additional benefit here of it gave it to me in the specific language for this cell. So doing this with Spark SQL, it gives me SQL language. If I change this back to PySpark and get rid of this and do the same thing, now it's going to give it to me in the PySpark approach, which is using Spark SQL to query the data, put it into a data frame, and then it presents the data frame in the programmatic language. So that's at least a benefit you get from connecting in lakehouses and warehouses. All right, enough about that part of the UI. Last two things I want to call out here at the top, or three things I want to call out at the top. Connecting. So again, opening the notebook and sitting here right now, I have no compute provisioned right now. I would have to use this connect button to do that, and I can do that either with the standard session or iConcurrency. We'll get to that in a moment. Secondly, a run all button. So again, this is cell-driven development. So if I hover over each of my cells, I can choose to run individual cells once I have my session up and running. Or if I hit this button, it's going to start up a session because obviously otherwise I'd push this button and nothing would happen, and that's a really bad UI experience. This button up here lets me run all cells. And you get a couple of controls here depending on certain use cases of how you might want to work with your data. Last thing here is your environment. So your environment here is again where most workspaces will have a default environment. Again, it defines the runtime, the type of compute you're expecting to run with. I could also define my own environment. So in this case, I do have a separate environment, but I'm going to use the default for today's demo. And then there's a couple of last minute things. We'll get to that in a little bit. All right, and don't forget to tell them about Data Wrangler. We'll come back to Data Wrangler in a little bit. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start up a session, which means I'm going to connect, start up a session. And this is where I start throwing salt over the shoulder to make sure the demo gods do not smite me for trying to do a live demo. And we'll let that run for a little bit. Once this successfully starts running, I should get a green circle over here that indicates that the session is running. Now, what you'll expect here is talking about environments in that compute environment. You're going to get a different experience depending on whether you use the default experience or the default starter pool versus if you're going to do a custom pool, which is if you want to start configuring things. Starter pools, you're actually accessing a pool environment that Microsoft manages. Most times, you'll be able to get this up and running in about 10 seconds or less. If you do a custom environment, this may take longer. At least doing this is kind of worrying me, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh my screen because I'm wondering if maybe. All right, we'll let that run for a moment. All right, so there's that, and there's the at least run all button. So that's at least a lot of the things that we can do. There we go. That's more what I expected. So session started up in 7 seconds. So if you worked in Databricks environments or other Apache Sparks environments, the fact that I got a session up and running in less than 10 seconds should seem a little bit odd. But again, that's where there's secret sauce happening here. There's basically a pool that's constantly running all the time, and you're basically just getting a connector into that pool. But it only works if you're using essentially what is the Microsoft default. Use anything else, expect a couple minutes for your session to start up. And I got the standard session up and running. And if I want to understand any information about it, I can get into the nitty-gritty. And again, talking to your admin, your session timeout here. So by default, your typical environment will expire in 20 minutes. What that means is if you sit here for 20 minutes and you do nothing actively in your Spark environment, after 20 minutes, your Spark compute will unprovision, and then you would have to hit connect to start it again. We're hopefully not going to be here for 20 minutes because then that means I've held you over, and I don't want to do that. All right. Now, what does this look like in terms of running things? So I'm going to go ahead and show an individual running of the cell, which completes the standard demo of showcasing that. Hopefully, it should only take a couple seconds here. And again, this is going to be just a basic top 1,000. While we wait for that to run, I'll draw your attention to, and of course, I had to say something. Um, so this is at least what a basic top 1,000 is, and this is what the UI looks like anytime you're using the display keyword to present data to your notebook. From here, you'll typically get things as a basic table. But from here, I can do a number of things in terms of inspection. So similar to what you've done with like Power BI or Power Query, where as you're working with your data, you can profile it a little bit. This environment will give you the same thing. So it'll give you this inspection screen over here. To do that, I could also create a new chart here. So if I wanted to um, graphically show my customer data, I could choose to do so here. I also can look at a little bit in terms of resources. So here's at least one of the ways that I can monitor, again, the number of vCores that were provisioned. So in this case, it provisioned 8 vCores, and looks like we had a total of one executor doing the function. It's just doing a top 1,000, so that's not all that surprising here. But here's at least a quick way of seeing this is how this cell is performing. All right, what else can we do with Python? This at least I'll bring up as just a quick note. This is for if you're working in environments where the lakehouse you're connecting to is schema enabled. This is only until Python lakehouse, or sorry, this is only until Fabric lakehouses with schemas are in preview. Once they go generally available, this is no longer a thing. But one of the weird things you might run into right now is you might have your notebook connected to the lakehouse as I showed earlier. You'll run a query against it and it'll give you a forbidden error, says you don't have access to it. That's a known issue right now. This specific line of code is what helps you work around that. So hopefully you don't run into that, but in case you run into a weird 500 forbidden error, this is why. And this is your workaround for it. Other useful things you can do. Parameter cells. So per notebook, you can have a single parameter cell defined. This is a toggle that right here, I can toggle the parameter cell here. What having a parameter cell does is this exposes this cell to other items in Fabric that might want to call it. So suppose I'm using an orchestration pipeline and my uh, I want to call this notebook, but I need to pass it in certain values in order for it to carry out its function. I can define in here the specific parameters that I want to have available. And then when I use something like a Python and tell it to call this notebook, it will be able to see these parameter values and give it a value that then gets passed in at the notebook's execution. But you can only have one of these cells per notebook. So let's talk environment. So using this UI over here is probably the easiest way to work with your data sitting in your lake house. But what if you want to do it in more of a programmatic sense and not necessarily rely on that UI? There's a couple of areas you can go. One is this really good article from Bradley Schacht. He's a member of the Fabric product team, knows quite a bit in this area. He has a very useful article gathering useful notebook and environment details at runtime. Take a look at his blog, and he showcases this string here, which is a number of ways of getting access to information about your environment, such as that default lakehouse GUID and the name of it that is over here. But I mean, that's at least still a fairly complicated way of having to go in and you have to look at the specific Spark environment. There's got to be a simpler way. And actually there is. There's two ways, in fact. One way is called SemPy. It's part of the semantic link library. If you want to take a look at that, look up semantic link, look up SemPy within Fabric. You should be able to find this. What this allows me to do is it allows me to essentially look at my Fabric environment as an object, and it has a whole lot of properties that I can use. The example I have here has, again, talking about that workspace environment where I might have dev test prod, and I want to be able to easily move my notebook from test to production, but I don't want to necessarily have to reassign the default lake house. What I can do is I can write something like this script, which lets me look at Fabric as an object, and I can actually navigate my workspaces and the lake houses within them as objects as well. This lets me get to a point where if I know that my lake house is going to have a consistent name in each environment, I can take a look at all the lake houses that exist in this current workspace and narrow down into what is the specific lake house that I'm looking for. That at least gives me an option for working with this environment, but not having to use the UI over here. So that's at least SemPy. Your other option you might want to take a look at when interacting with lake houses is called Notebook Utils. This previously was named MS Spark Utils. So if you see MS Spark Utils, it's called Notebook Utils now. This is something else that is unique to Fabric. And what this allows me to do is I can still look at my files and objects within a lake house with something like an absolute path. But then once I get past that point, I can use everything else in terms of very simple function calls to do certain administrative things in an automated way. So in an example like this, I'm using this script to create directories. So if I, in my lakehouse, need to create subdirectories, but I don't want to have to create them by hand, I can do that with notebook utils, and I can do it in a scripted fashion. If I need to move files from location to location, if you're dealing with a lot of unstructured data and maybe you need to process it time in and time out, something like this at least gives you the capabilities of where I don't have to uh, build a bunch of libraries that helps me access the ABFS environment or use an OS library, anything like that. Notebook utils automatically gets context of your Fabric environment, and then all you have to use is some basic function calls to do things like movements of files, which is like what I am doing here. So you can get at least pretty sophisticated with some of these use cases in the same way we have done with languages like this for data engineering, be it more with structured data or unstructured data. And again, it's simplified by things like SemPy and notebook utils. Data frames. So I glossed over this a little bit earlier, but data frames, there's actually two types of data frames, actually technically three types of data frames that you can work with within Fabric. One is pandas, which is the one that is widely used in the industry. There's also Spark data frames, which is exclusive to the Spark environment. And then in some situations, you also see notation of Fabric data frames. That's more of a case by case basis. So I wouldn't worry about those too strongly unless you're getting into certain types of workloads. There, at least for the most part, what's the difference between working with them? Functionally, most times you won't notice a difference. The biggest difference you'll probably run into is performance considerations. Again, Spark made for distributed computing. Pandas made for in-memory computing. So depending on which one you use, that might impact your performance, and I would weigh that with the size of data set that you're working with. Good question, Emily, as far as like, okay, so effectively monitoring this. And actually, I'm trying to think if I really showcase this here. We'll see if this, if any of my runs are in here. So aside from at least the UI I showed earlier, which does a notebook by notebook, I can also go into the monitoring section of Fabric. Your notebook runs will show up as a instance here, and I can also take a look at resources here. So this is at least where, if you want to get particular about your Spark jobs and how all of that is administered, you can take a look at that here. I can also see here, and this is something that I can look at after the fact. Right now, I'm looking at my active session. So, and I've only really run one cell here, so there's not a whole lot to show. But after the fact, this is a good area where you can see some more details about, again, how much is running, how much is allocated. If you do dynamic allocation, this will show you when maybe nodes were unprovisioned and then potentially reprovisioned, all the things along those lines. And especially it'll give you some inbox metrics around things like efficiency where, okay, I've had a session running for about 20 minutes right now, and I've only run things a little bit. It's not very efficient, right? Um, so that would at least be the other place that I would typically expect to monitor it, at least in most cases. And then from there, as far as transforming data, that's where at least anything that you can do in Python, you can do that here. So I've got basic examples here of, anywhere from creating data frames, adding in columns to data frames, filtering. And admittedly, I'm going to go through this quickly because, a lot of times you may just be looking at this in terms of transforming data. And you could certainly go ahead and you could write a very large handwritten script to do this. Or you can use built-in tools that might help you get started with some common functions, especially talking data quality. That's where I'm actually going to get my one demo running. Just put it down here. This demo environment is running here. And I'm going to show you at least one important tool you should know. Copilot, really useful if your capacity supports it, but you need an F64 SKU or higher to make use of that. And I'm running on an F2 SKU right now. But your other tool that you have that'll always be available regardless of SKU is Data Wrangler. Yes, Emily. I see a hand raised.
Well, I see a little icon for Visual Studio Code. So here I'm thinking, hey, why don't I open in Visual Studio Code and I can just use my GitHub Copilot?
That is another option. So I will say at least that option works. For me, I'll say I've had success and not so great success with it. Sometimes, at least when you use VS Code with it, yes, at that point, then you can use GitHub Copilot. But sometimes I've had it where sometimes I can make changes to it and get it published back out here and it works fine. Other times, like I can get code change and then like the notebook out in Fabric gets really confused about what I'm doing. And because of that, then I basically then need to like save off my notebook in VS Code and re-upload it. So you are correct, Emily. That is an option for that Copilot capabilities. If you have GitHub Copilot available, and admittedly, that's a like cost-wise, GitHub Copilot's fairly cheap. So I'd say that's at least a good use case for that. The data frame option with Data Wrangler, you can think of this as like giving you the Power Query approach. But if I want to generate code instead of just, or if I want to generate either Spark or Python code, rather than having to just generate M code and have it be specific to something like a data flow or a report. So here's where like this, whoever created this data set really likes Weird Al Yankovic. I don't know what the deal is with that guy. Um, But I mean, this is where Data Wrangler is going to give you that Power Query experience. So you can quickly do things like, all right, I can deduplicate data. I can say age. All right, that's a decimal field. Age is not a decimal. So let's maybe say I'm going to, um, And at least I happen to know that this data set is detecting this as text. It's not even detecting it as numeric. So suppose I need to change the column type to something like a, either I can try and do it directly to an integer or I'll just do it to a float. So at least can convert it into that data type, and age shouldn't be something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and round age to 0 decimals because it shouldn't have any decimals. So you can do the same sorts of things that you can do in Power Query, but here's the power. Up here at the top, then, I can hit Add Code to Notebook. And for sake of demo, I'll include it as both Pandas and PySpark. So it took what I just did in a UI to clean up my data, and it generated both Spark code, which would be working in a data frame that makes best use of processing for large data, or does it in Pandas if I'm dealing with a smaller data set and want to work with it that way. And it gives me this sort of thing now directly added into my code. And it adds it in as a cell. So now if that takes care of my data cleanup, now I can add in a cell beyond it and work with a data frame that has clean data. Data Wrangler, especially, I look at it as not only a time-saving tool for cleaning data, but also between that and some of what Emily's talking about for GitHub Copilot, really useful tools for education. And I think honestly, that's the biggest thing people should think about when utilizing this is you can go and you can read articles and all that if you want, or you can maybe consider speeding it up by working with a Copilot to teach you the language. Just as always, remember, you're working with AI. It's not 100% guaranteed to be accurate. But I'll say for things like this, if you're asking basic questions about the language, it's usually pretty accurate about things like that. So that's a lot of what you can do with Fabric and notebooks and working with code. It's a wonderful experience. And hopefully this shows that some of the some of the things that you don't have to do with administering environments, some of the things you don't have to deal with in terms of connecting into lake houses for simplicity's sake, there's a whole lot of benefit to be gained here. All right, we're getting to be about at time, so let me do a quick wrap up here then. All right, so we showed a number of things here in terms of what you can do in terms of UIs, that parameters, so thinking about that orchestration, being able to get easy information about our environment without having to go and find it by hand all by ourselves. In transformations, we can add columns. You can do case statements, conditionally populate things, which I didn't showcase too strongly, but it's in the code there as a third degree language. You can easily display information like I showed in that UI. Um, and at least some of those considerations around working with the lake house schemas. So this is a quick gunshot of information. So what's your next step? Well, hopefully this is at least enough for you to jump in, get busy with that environment and take those next steps. So what am I encouraging? A couple of communities out there that are especially on LinkedIn is Microsoft Fabric Learning and Microsoft Fabric Community. If you're not familiar with them, get out there. There's a lot of content creators like myself who are making content on things like working with PySpark and Fabric or other topics. So definitely get out there. I also at least have there are plenty of articles, and these are just basic examples of if you want to learn more about Senpai, there's a lot of documentation out there. Microsoft Learn also has documentation on notebook utils. All good content if you're wanting to go out and look for it. If you want a couple recommendations of specific content creators I'd encourage you to watch, here's a couple I'd recommend. First of all, Tales from the Field. If you're not familiar with them, they're a Microsoft team that runs a YouTube channel all about Fabric. And they do a little bit of Azure SQL, but I'll say their primary focus is Fabric these days. They'll show you especially additional ins and outs about PySpark beyond what I showed you today. If Python's more what you're looking to learn, Programming with Mosh, great YouTube channel for educational content. He has this great video. It'll teach you like pretty good fundamental Python in about an hour video. And I've gone through the whole thing. It's really good. For me personally, at least a little bit of self-advocation. I talk about a lot of this as well on my YouTube channel called Data Bard. Do a lot of educational content like this. I also do a little bit of goofy stuff too. I just released a music video called Seasons of AI. So if you want to hear me sing, check that out. And if nothing else, use those built-in capabilities. Data Wrangler, Copilot if you have the SKU for it, GitHub Copilot if you can easily export it out to Visual Studio Code. And that brings us to the end of the content. So I'm at least here for recommending content a little bit. So I'll give people a moment to ask those questions. Again, self-advocacy for me. If you liked my content and you'd like to see more of it, or if you have specific questions you want me to make content on, the QR code there goes to my YouTube channel. Feel free to like and subscribe. I'd be happy to help share more content out there. LinkedIn's probably the best um, social media that I use. I use that quite a bit. Blue Sky, I'm also out there as well. Feel free to connect out with me on social media. Ask any questions you got. I'm happy to help in any way possible. All right, Emily, you asked another question. What are the recommended approaches for handling sensitive data and implementing security in PySpark notebooks in Fabric? Ooh, that's an interesting one. So, looking at things from the lens of So a lot of at least the security I would advocate for is where you want to make sure your data is secured at rest. Because for a lot of things like working with notebooks, you give people like contributor access and there's not much stopping them from starting up a notebook and working with sensitive data unless the data itself is secured. So there, certainly at least the easiest ways to do it would be um, you can use or you can put notebooks in one workspace. You can put lake houses in a different workspace, and if you can at least control sensitivity lake house by lake house, you can then share the lake house individually with that user, and then they will at least still be able to build notebooks against that one. If you have to get more granular than that, there's controls, but I think that's more of a case by case basis of either like lake houses, you can control security by individual folders. Um, if you're working with SQL endpoints or warehouses, there you get row level security as an option. So you can build out more granular security there. So the options are there, but I'd say at least the general guidelines would be make sure you're controlling that per user, you're controlling the security for the data at rest. That's going to be your most secure option because that at least should limit what they should be able to do with their notebooks.
All right. Thank you so much for an intriguing session. It's been an absolute pleasure. Anybody else out there who have questions before we let you go on to Disneyland? Then I'm just going to say thank you so much and enjoy California and Disneyland. I wish I was going.
I'll invite you around next time.
Oh, thank
But
you so
uh,
much.
but yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to speak. Hopefully this was helpful for everybody. And again, any questions you have for me after the fact, please feel free to reach out. And I'm looking to improve as a presenter at any point. So if anybody has feedback, I would welcome that as well, so that I can continue to tell stories to educate others in the community.
Thank you.
All right, you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Take care.